So here we have the medium level standard English conventions questions from the Khan Academy. And this includes both the boundaries questions and the form, structure, and sense questions. So all of the ones that have this prompt, conforming to the conventions of standard English, are mixed in here without much consideration for whether they are boundaries or form, structure, and sense. So we'll go ahead and get to it. And I'll shrink this down so that it all fits. So humans were, long thought, to have occupied or begun occupying the Peruvian settlement of Machu Picchu between 1440 and 1450. However, a team used accelerator mass spectrometry to uncover evidence that it was occupied earlier in 1420 CE, humans were likely inhabiting the area. Okay, so this is definitely a boundaries question. And what are we looking at here? Well, this portion here is definitely an independent clause. That's an independent clause. So this is going to have to do with, avoiding a run-on. The fact that that is an independent clause means that we need something stronger than just a comma. Meaning that we definitely need some punctuation. The answer is going to be C, and I'll come back and mention something about A in just a second. But the reason it's going to be C is this. We have this as an independent clause. A team led by this. A team used this technique to uncover evidence that it was occupied earlier. Namely, that it was occupied earlier, and then we're going to have a period. And so that's an independent clause. And then what we have with this portion here that I'll put in green is just kind of, prepositional phrase and then some kind of interruption. Yeah. So the main thing that, that tells us that we do need something stronger than just a comma is going to be the fact that we do have the two independent clauses and we don't have any fanboys conjunctions for, and, nor, but, or, yet. So the problem with A is, it could have said something like this, that it was occupied earlier, which actually the problem with A is that when you go with the comma and the which, it needs to be modifying the thing that comes right before it. And it doesn't make sense here to think of which as modifying earlier. So let me think of a counterexample of when you might want to use which. My car, which is parked in the driveway, has a flat tire. Okay, which is modifying or referring to car, which in this case does not make sense referring to earlier, so that's not going to work. So yeah, one would be C. Studying the deepest. Actually, we don't even need the first sentence here or the second sentence. We just need the last sentence. Specially designed submarines and robots can explore this realm or zone, but blank, highly expensive and limited by technical challenges. Well, submarines and robots. Even if there were just submarines or just robots, that would be plural. Still plural. So we need plural. And the only plural option, well, okay, B is plural. C is also plural, but there's no reason to say we here, right? We are not submarines and robots. They are submarines and robots, so that's that. Yeah, but A and D are both singular. So it's not about the agreement between the pronoun and the verb. It's about the agreement between the pronoun and the verb and the antecedent, namely, again, submarines and robots. And so that's plural. That needs to be plural. Plural and third person. So this one will have to do with verb tense. Verb tense. And how can we tell that? Because all of these would agree with the same noun. And the other clue, and I'll link to a video on this if I can remember to do it, if your subject is right next to the blank, it's probably not a subject-verb agreement question. But again, Lincoln will, Lincoln is, Lincoln has, Lincoln leveraged, all of those are fine from a subject-verb agreement perspective, so it's going to be a matter of figuring out the right tense. Okay, so here we do want to read the whole thing. So after winning the election, Lincoln appointed these people to his cabinet. His decision was surprising, since each of these men had run against him, but historians have praised it, noting that Lincoln blank his rivals' diverse talents. Well, we're definitely talking about the past, not the future, not the present. What about C versus D? Well, this is the only one that's actually in the past tense. C would be in the, let's think about it, the present perfect. Perfect because it has a form of the verb to have as the auxiliary verb, and present because that form is the present, right? So had leveraged would be the past perfect, will have leveraged would be the future perfect, but this is the present perfect. And when would you use the present perfect? Well, if you were talking about somebody who was still continuing. So maybe if they were talking about, oh, this is 2023, oh, President Biden. Biden has leveraged his rivals' diverse talents, and that would make sense, but not in the case of Lincoln, who died, over 150 years ago at this point. So we definitely want the past, and that is D. Number 4, while exploring Nevada's Gypsum Cave, and just looking at the answer choices, this is going to have something to do with either subject-verb agreement or verb form, possibly verb tense. But let's see. Parker's finding was the first to place humans in North America as far back as 10,000 years ago. Yeah, so, okay. So the finding was, that's our subject, and that's our verb. What are we looking for then? We're not looking for a finite verb, meaning, a verb that could be a main verb. Place is one of those. Places is one of those. And placed is one of those. At least, at least all of them could be main verbs. This is the infinitive, and that's what we want. It was the first one to place humans in North America as far like that. It's like, the first person, to walk on the moon, allegedly. To first person to walk on the moon. So what is this? This would be called an infinitive phrase, and it's acting as kind of a big. Let's see, the first person. Yeah, I mean it's acting as a modifier. It's that modifies person. The first finding to place humans in North America as far back. So yeah, we want the infinitive. So yeah, I would call that a question of verb form. Another verb-related question. Let's see. The African Games co-production market. Okay, so this one will be subject-verb agreement. And one of the hallmarks of the subject-verb agreement questions is that they do like to separate the subject from the verb or the blank, using things like interruptions, which we have here. So our subject is really the market. So the market promotes. And so singular, singular. And yes, a verb ending in an S is singular usually. All of these would pair with a plural subject, and so this is another hallmark of the subject-verb agreement question. If your correct answer is singular, quite often, honestly most of the time, the other three options will be plural, and then vice versa. If your correct answer is plural, the other three options will usually be singular. Number 6. How do scientists determine And this is definitely going to be a boundaries question. And before we even go any farther, I'm going to go ahead and say that we can eliminate two options. Which two options are those going to be? Answer choices A and C. And the reason for that is this. When that's the only difference, period, uppercase, semicolon, lowercase, when that's the only difference, you can get rid of both of them. And I made a video about that called semicolon equals period. The number one punctuation rule in the digital SAT, also true of the paper SAT, and it has to do with the fact that both semicolons and periods are used to connect independent clauses. The differences between them are too subjective, and so, yeah, you can't choose between them. The other thing we don't want to do is put a colon right after a word like that. Our answer is going to have to be B, but let's go ahead and read the sentence. So researchers were limited to studying the marks found on the fossilized teeth of skeletons, but in 2017, a team led by so-and-so tried something new. Well, what was that? Sequencing the DNA found in Neanderthals' fossilized dental plaque. So here I like to talk about with the colon the idea that we have a setup and then a payoff. The setup is something that builds toward something, creates a sense of expectation. And then the payoff fulfills that sense of expectation. And it's going to start with sequencing. So the setup and then the payoff. These are not technical grammar terms, but what you want to keep in mind is that the setup will need to be an independent clause. The payoff can be an independent clause or not. And in this case, it's not. This would be some kind of phrase. Sequencing is a gerund in this case. It's an ing word that's functioning as a noun. Sequencing the DNA. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like saying, jogging is exercise. Sequencing, it doesn't really matter what we call it. We can eliminate all the others for reasons. You don't want to put a colon in the midst of a single phrase. Sequencing the DNA. You're never going to put a colon in the midst of a phrase like that, regardless of what kind of phrase it is. So, another kind of boundaries question. In 1959, so-and-so founded the Underwater Adventure Seekers, a scuba diving club that is the oldest blah, blah, blah. Okay, so one thing we can note here, this is not an absolute rule, but you're generally not going to have any punctuation right before or after the word that. Why? Well, because usually the word that is being used to introduce a necessary clause, something that is not an interruption. B, you could say, what about B? It doesn't have punctuation right before the word that. That would create problems later on in the sentence. If we picked B, the sentence would say this. He founded the Underwater Adventure Seekers, a scuba diving club, and that is the oldest club for black divers in the United States, and that has helped thousands of diving. No. So we don't want to do that. We want to say it's a scuba diving club that is the oldest for divers and that has helped thousands of diving enthusiasts. Yeah, it's a scuba diving club that has done this and done that. I don't think they even needed to have the second that there, but I wish I had a better explanation for this, but it's definitely going to be A. And yeah, if you put the comma there, it obscures the fact that this whole portion is a kind of modifier. It's modifying scuba diving club. What kind of scuba diving club? It's a scuba diving club that is the oldest and that has helped thousands. Boundaries. Okay. 9 months before, Rosa Parks made history by refusing to comply with the seating policy on a Montgomery, Alabama bus. And tisk tisk, there should be a comma there. But anyway, that's a long introductory portion. I think you would say it's kind of a kind of prepositional. I don't know what you would call it, but it's a lengthy phrase of some sort, or concatenation of phrases. Our main clause, our independent clause here, is going to be a 15-year-old girl was arrested for the same offense. So regardless of which answer choice we pick, that is an independent clause. And then we've got, according to some historians, Colvin's arrest led to Parks's action and eventually to the desegregation of the Montgomery bus system. Well, that's another independent clause. So we've got an independent clause here in green and an independent clause there in red. And just like on an earlier question that we saw, according to Berger, according to some historians, again, I don't know how I would classify that, but the important thing here is that we've got the two independent clauses, the one in green and the one in red. So we need something more than just a comma to join them, and so it's going to be C. So it doesn't matter that you have some little thing in between, like again, however we classify according to some historians. You can't join two independent clauses with a phrase like according to some historians. You need either a semicolon, a period, or a comma and a fanboys conjunction. And so the only option we have here is the period. Definitely a boundaries question. So the 2022 Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded to 3 pioneers in the field of click chemistry, whatever that is. 2-time Nobel laureate winner Barry Sharpless, who coined the term click chemistry in 1998. Carolyn Bertozzi, founder of the Bertozzi Group. Okay, so here we're actually, this is something that they're testing more on the digital SAT than they ever did on the paper SAT, and that is the use of semicolons to punctuate complex lists. And so when I say that the semicolon equals the period, this would be the one case where they're not equivalent. But notice that they don't even give you the period as an answer choice, so it's not something that you have to encounter or deal with. But the 3 items in the list are this one, and this one. Blue, yellow, green. And why do I call them items? Well, they're talking about 3 pioneers, 3 people who were ahead of at the forefront of their field. They were early to do something. And so why use the semicolons though? Because we've got commas within the items. Right? We can see in each, it doesn't matter if all of them have the comma. If at least one of the things being listed contains a comma, then you'd want to separate those list items with a semicolon. Otherwise, it gets confusing. So they've definitely had several questions on the Blue Book test that involve this use of the semicolon. And here we see it in the Khan Academy questions. Here I'm just going to look at the second sentence because that's probably going to be all that we need. It's another punctuation question. The installation, visible from Route 66 and the newer and busier Interstate 40, has become a popular tourist attraction and an iconic symbol of Americana. And so we've got the main portion of our sentence. The installation has become a popular tourist attraction, etc. And then we've got our interruption. That's, it's not unnecessary in the sense of, giving unnecessary information, but it's unnecessary in the sense that you could take out that yellow portion and still have a complete sentence. the installation has become a popular tourist attraction. And so, since it starts with a comma, it needs to end with a comma. The only other thing that could have conceivably been an answer here would have been D, but we would have needed a dash at the beginning, and we don't have that. So our answer is definitely going to be B. I hope it's not annoying that it's that big on the screen. I'll shrink it down. Okay, so in 2008, 2 years after the death of science fiction writer Octavia Butler, the Huntington Library in California received a collection. Okay, so this is different. Here the interruption is something I'm just going to go ahead and cross out because it already is punctuated. And then in 2008, we can cross out because that's just a little introductory prepositional phrase. So the Huntington Library in California received a collection. So it's not like it's saying, Los Angeles, California. And again, this is not something they're going to test you on, but the correct way to punctuate a city and state or city and country combination is to put the comma after the second one. So, Los Angeles, California is a big city. Okay. But that's not what we have here. It's just saying the Huntington Library in California. And in California is a prepositional phrase. And prepositional phrases don't require extra punctuation. We don't need to add it. So the Huntington Library received a collection. The Huntington Library in California received a collection. And that's all. That's all we need. So sometimes you can save time on these questions by, you don't necessarily need to read the whole passage. And that's really only true of the standard English conventions questions and then the rhetorical synthesis questions at the end, where you don't need to read the bullet points most of the time. The human brain is primed, sort of like ready, to receive or recognize faces. So much so that, due to a perceptual tendency called this, blank will even find faces in cloud. Okay, so this is noun-pronoun agreement. What is the human brain? Well, it's a singular, third-person, inanimate. Well, it's part of an animal, the human, but itself, it's singular. Yeah, is it inanimate? It's an it. It's an it. Just like you would talk about your heart as being an it, or your stomach, or your toe. So if it had said human brains, then they. You definitely don't want to, it's not about misgendering the brain. It's about giving a gender to the brain. And the brain is not a he. It's not a she. Again, it's an it. So the human brain, blah, blah, blah. It will even find faces in clouds, etc. Looks like possessive pronoun versus contraction confusion, along with singular versus plural confusion. So, this poet's star quilt poems offer an unusually open-ended reading experience. Plural. So we can get rid of those. The poems. And so we want the possessive. But if you see this pattern of answer choices, some combination of it's, there, possibly that, possibly they'll mix in that, which is not a word. But that tells you that there are two factors. One, you have to decide whether you have a possessive like A or C, or a contraction like B or D, but then also whether you have a singular like C or D, and then versus a plural like A or B. So two different distinctions, but usually on these questions they're asking you about possessive pronouns. They're not usually asking you about contractions. But either way, those are the two things you need to make sure to check, and this one is definitely going to be A because poems is plural. This will be verb tense. And once again, like the earlier verb tense question, we can see that this is something they like to do, that they often do when it's a verb tense question. They put the blank right next to the subject. So again, they don't put the blank right next to the subject if it's subject-verb agreement. But by the time this king did something to the throne, the number of longhorn cattle had drastically increased. And that's a clue. Had increased. That's the past perfect. When do you use the past perfect? To refer to one thing that happened before some other thing in the past. But really, the fact that this is in the past perfect tells us that this needs to be in the past tense. I can come back and say that again. By the time he did this, he had already done this other thing. Now, by the time we arrived at the party, it had already ended. Or by the time I arrived at the party, my friends had already left. So past perfect, again. Perfect because it has some form of the verb to have as the auxiliary verb, and past because that auxiliary verb is indeed in the past tense. So had increased. And then drastically is just an adverb. But the whole verb phrase would be had increased. So the answer there will be B. In 2022, mountain guide Phil Henderson led the Full Circle Expedition, a team of mountaineers that became the first all-black team. Yep. And this is not something we need to nitpick over, but I would say since mountaineers are people, that you'd actually want to use who. Unless this word is really referring to team, in which case it makes sense to use that. But in any event, as I was just saying a few questions ago, you're generally not going to have any reason to put punctuation right before that. And then B creates issues that are quite similar to the issues created by answer choice B on number 7. Yeah, a team of mountaineers that became the first team of climbers to summit Mount Everest, to climb to the summit of Mount Everest, and that works to promote diversity and representation in outdoor adventure sports. Yep, really, really similar to that earlier question in more ways than one. In content as well. But more to the point in grammar, in that we've got a scuba diving club that is the oldest and that has helped thousands. A team of mountaineers that became the first and that works to promote diversity, etc. So very similar. So another boundaries type question. In 1727, this person presented a new play, Double Falsehood, at a London theater. He claimed that his drama was based on a little-known play by William Shakespeare, Cardenio. Many, including Alexander Pope, were skeptical, but historians have determined that Shakespeare's company did perform a play called Cardenio. Okay, so what do we have here? Well, we have an independent clause. Many were skeptical. That could stand on its own and be a complete sentence. Many is a subject. Were is a verb. Skeptical, I guess we could just say that's the predicate. It describes many. And then our second independent clause here is historians have determined blah, 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 blah. So that's a second independent clause. So independent clause in green, independent clause in blue. So one way that we can join two independent clauses would be with a comma and a conjunction. So we hadn't seen that yet in this batch, but certainly that's a way that we can join them. We've seen the period, we've seen, I think, the semicolon maybe. but it definitely makes sense to have the contrast word here, because on the one hand, many were skeptical. On the other hand, historians have determined that they did perform such a play. 17. I'm just going to read the second sentence. The arrangement of the figures, according to so-and-so, represents her idea. Yep, so this is punctuating an interruption. The arrangement of the figures represents her idea. So, according to Swentzel, that's a little interruption. And so since it starts with a comma, we end it with a comma. And I don't know what else to say about that other than, hopefully these kinds of questions are clicking, because honestly, they're not the hardest if you can get the hang of them. I guess you could say that about anything. Once you know how to do it, it's not that hard. But I think those are relatively straightforward. I hope. So-and-so was one of the most beloved Lebanese singers of the 20th century. Her broad singing repertoire lent her a timeless, cross-generational appeal. So verb form, earning her the moniker the Soul of Lebanon. Okay, so how do we know that it's going to be earning? I'll tell you. Okay, first of all, to simplify things, we want to get rid of the lengthy interruption and focus on the real bare bones of the sentence. And we could even eliminate that adjective and that adjective if you wanted. Her repertoire lent her a or an appeal. So this portion, we didn't have to cross all of that out, but that is the independent clause here in this sentence. It's what makes it a complete sentence. And noticing this, what comes after it, we just have a comma and then a blank. We're not going to have a second independent clause. So that means we need to make this, that means we don't want a finite verb. We don't want a main type of verb. And earn, earned, and has earned, those would all be main verbs. Specifically earn, earned, and has. Like they earned, she has, etc. All of there's different tenses involved, different aspects as far as, the present perfect, the past, the simple past, the simple present. But those all could be the main verb in the sentence. We want something that's not a main verb. We want the participle here, and that's going to be be. So this portion here, earning her the moniker, the Soul of Lebanon. And notice here that we could also call this entire portion a modifier, and that we could have put that at the beginning of the sentence. Earning her the moniker, the Soul of Lebanon, her broad singing repertoire. Well, what earned her that moniker? Maybe it wasn't the broad singing repertoire, but in any event, this portion here is we'd say it's a participle phrase that is describing or modifying something earlier in the sentence. Is it modifying Fairuz? Is it modifying her repertoire? Is it modifying her appeal? I'm not sure, but it's modifying something. And the important thing, really, more so than what it's modifying, is the fact that, again, it's not going to give us a run-on sentence or a poorly constructed sentence, because we do not want the finite verb here. I could have done better on that explanation. I'll do better on this one, hopefully. Okay, this is let's see, determine. This is subject-verb agreement. So notice here that the blank is not right next to the subject. How do we know that? Well, of a river is a prepositional phrase, and a prepositional phrase will never contain the subject. So they like to separate the subject from the blank on subject-verb agreement questions. So the curves determine. And as I was saying earlier, I think this is the flip side of what we saw earlier. A correct answer is plural. All three of those are singular. Yes, here our correct answer was singular and the incorrect ones were all plural. We're almost there. It's a long video because I combined, or a lot of questions because I combined two different categories into one. Okay, so far from being modern inventions, blank. Okay, so this would be an example of an opening modifier. This is the first modifier or dangling modifier question. So what is far, or what were far from being modern inventions? Sumerians? I don't think so. Sumerians are kind of people. They're not inventions or far from being modern inventions. I think it's going to be the straws. Drinking straws. Yes, okay. And this one is a little bit unusual in the sense that typically when you see the passive voice in one of these questions, it's a sign that you have the wrong answer. But here is an exception. And the reason is, I mean, why is passive voice usually a sign of a wrong answer? Because it just has to do with, I would point you to the video I did on recognizing and correcting dangling modifiers. That when you have a dangling modifier question, well, first of all, what is a dangling modifier? It's a modifier that opens the sentence and it is not adjacent to the noun that it's supposed to be modifying. So here we've got 4 different nouns that start things out. Sumerians, drinking straws, ancient Mesopotamia, and the use of drinking straws. So we need the correct subject to follow this modifier. So again, what were far from being modern inventions? Drinking straws. So I guess you can take this, even though it's a Khan Academy question, it's College Board approved, and it shows that you can't necessarily eliminate a wrong answer or eliminate an answer merely because it contains the passive voice. But I will also say that I never saw a correct answer on the paper SAT that employed passive voice, at least as far as dangling modifier questions go. But as this shows, it certainly can be correct. It can be correct. It's all about really finding that right noun, that correct noun to go right after the modifier. Archaeologists, have estimated that this city had as many as 20,000 inhabitants in the year 1150. Blank, 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 blank. Okay, so making it, yep. So 1150. And I don't know why they left out the CE in answer choice B. I'm going to go ahead and say that they probably meant to include that there. It doesn't really matter, but I think it would help to illustrate this point, which I made previously in this video, about how if you have 2 answer choices that only differ with respect to the semicolon, the period, lowercase, and the capital, you can eliminate both of them. But it doesn't really matter if you had the CE or not. You would still have the same basic issue, namely that if you were to use a semicolon or a period, what you get after it is not an independent clause, and so you can't use either one of these. The semicolon and the period are going to both need to be preceded and followed by independent clauses. So making it one of the largest cities in North America at the time, so that's a phrase. Making it, it's a participle phrase, and so we need the comma before it. There are situations in which you could have a participle phrase, an ing word, a phrase beginning with an ing word that didn't need a comma. Let me think. I'm going to try to make a separate video on that. But something like this, I saw my friend walking to the store. So you don't need a comma there, but I need to get into more of, I need to go over some notes so that I get some more precision in what I'm saying. But if you don't have a comma, it's going to make it seem as if your phrase, the phrase beginning with the ing word, is modifying or describing the noun right next to it. And we're definitely not, in this case, we're not trying to modify or describe the year 1150 CE. We're talking about St. Louis or Cahokia. Okay. Few more. A subseasonal weather forecast attempts to predict weather conditions 3 to 4 weeks in advance. Blank. Its predictions are therefore more short-term than those of the seasonal forecast. Blah, blah, blah. So here I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of that because that is kind of peripheral to what we're looking at. This is a boundaries question, and so we've got an independent clause up to and including the word advance. And then we've got a second independent clause. Its predictions are more short-term than the predictions of the seasonal forecast. So that's another independent clause. Frustrating. Okay. So we need more than just a comma. So C would result in a comma splice. We definitely need some punctuation. We can't just join them with and. We can't just join them with a comma. We would need, at the very least, if we were going to use a comma and a conjunction, although I still think there would be issues with that combination here. So we're going to go with the semicolon because, we could have used a period, but this gets back to the semicolon period idea. If you can use a semicolon, you can use a period or vice versa. So if you're ever stuck on the semicolon, you could ask yourself, could I use a period here? The answer is yes, then you can use the semicolon. And that's what we get on number 22. So 22 is B. And then our last one will have something to do with subject, not subject-verb, but noun-pronoun agreement. This disparity can be explained by the fact that rivers such as the Mississippi expand and contract as. So we're not talking about just the Mississippi. We're talking about rivers in general, of which this one is just one example. Rivers expand and contract as they. They. So once again, like the earlier question of this type, we've got two singular options and two plural options, but one of the plural options is we, and I don't think that would be too tempting. And so when you see a pronoun and a verb together, don't focus on whether they agree with each other. They're going to agree with each other. Focus on whether that pronoun agrees with the noun that it is referring to. And again, in this case, that noun is rivers, and so we need the plural pronoun they. So any questions, any that you would like me to go over in more detail, leave those questions in the comments and I'll see what I can do.